No preamble today, let's get right into it. And we'll talk after. For years, there has been a stubborn resistance to interpreting these trends as indications that something is biologically wrong with our population level. We have repeatedly refused to read them as danger signals, warning us that we are heading for a major evolutionary disaster. Everything possible has been done to outlaw these practices and to protect the breeding and living rights of all human individuals. Then, as the groups of human animals have swollen to increasingly unmanageable proportions, we have applied our ingenuity to advancing technologies that help to make these unnatural social conditions bearable. As each day passes, adding as it does so another 150,000 to the world population, the struggle becomes more difficult. If present attitudes persist, it will soon become impossible. Something will eventually arrive to reduce our population level, no matter what we do. Perhaps it will be heightened mental instability leading to reckless utilization of weapons of uncontrollable power. Perhaps it will be mounting chemical pollution or wildfire diseases of plague intensity. We have a choice. Either we can leave matters to a chance, or we can attempt to influence the situation. If we take the former course, then there is a very real danger that, when a major population control factor does break through our defenses and start to operate, it will be like the bursting of a dam and will carry away our whole civilization. If we take the latter course, we may be able to avert this disaster. But how do we set about selecting our method of control? The idea of enforcing any particular anti-breeding or anti-living device is unacceptable to our fundamentally cooperative nature. The only alternative is to encourage voluntary controls. We could, of course, promote and glamorize increasingly dangerous sports and pastimes. We might popularize suicide. Why wait for disease? Die now, painlessly. Or perhaps create a sophisticated new celibacy cult, purity for kicks. Advertising agencies throughout the world might be employed to pour out persuasive propaganda extolling the virtues of instant dying. Even if we took such extraordinary and biologically wasteful steps, it is doubtful if they would lead to a significant level of population control. The method more generally favored today is advanced contraception, with the added secondary measure of legalized abortion in the case of unwanted pregnancies. The argument favoring contraception, as I pointed out in an earlier chapter, is that preventing life is better than curing it. If something has to die, it is better that it should be human eggs and sperm rather than thinking, feeling human beings, cared for and caring, who have already become an integral and interdependent part of society. If the argument of repugnant waste is applied to contraceived eggs and sperm, it can be pointed out that nature is already remarkably wasteful where these products are concerned, the human female being capable of producing around 400 eggs during a lifetime, and the adult male literally millions of sperm every day. There are drawbacks nevertheless. Just as dangerous sports are likely to eliminate selectively the more adventurous spirits in society, and suicides the more highly strung and imaginative, so contraception may favor a bias against the more intelligent. At their present stage of development, contraceptive devices require a certain level of intelligence, thoughtfulness, and self-control if they are to be utilized efficiently. Anyone below that level will be more liable to conceive. If their low level of intelligence is in any way governed by genetic factors, these factors will be passed on to their offspring. Slowly but surely, these genetic qualities will spread and increase in the population as a whole. For modern contraception to work effectively and without bias, therefore, it is essential for urgent progress to be made in the direction of finding less and less demanding techniques which require the absolute minimum of care and attention. Coupled with this must be a major assault on social attitudes towards contraception practices. Only when there are 150,000 fewer fertilizations per day than there are at present will we be holding the human population steady at its already overgrown level. Furthermore, although this is difficult enough in itself to achieve, we must add to it the problem of ensuring that the increase in control is suitably spread around the world, rather than concentrated in one or two enlightened regions. If contraceptive advances are unevenly distributed geographically, they will inevitably lead to the destabilizing of already strained interregional relationships. Okay, so there's just so much here to talk about, and perhaps just some context. First of all, perhaps if you're not familiar with this book, you're wondering when this was written, which is a good question. And this particular version is older than I am, but it's not the first version. This one was published in 79, but the original was published in 69. So it's all over 50 years old, and it's remarkable how relevant these issues remain. So let's go through parts of what Morris is talking about one by one, and we can go into it in more detail. So first of all, the most obvious thing is that, like many intellectuals of his era and before, he was wrong about this panic around overpopulation. He was far from the only one that feared this, but there was this panic that the population of the Earth is just going to increase exponentially, and if we don't do something, we're just going to starve to death because there's going to be too many people, and eventually it's just going to pop like a bubble. And millions will die, potentially. It's going to be chaos. So this didn't happen, and it really only requires some basic understanding of economics and concepts like homeostasis to understand that just because a trend you can observe and measure in the present exists, it doesn't mean that it will persist indefinitely. And that as one variable increases or becomes more extreme in some way, however you measure it, there are corresponding forces that are then provoked. And so the idea that one variable just charges forward ahead unimpeded by any reactive element, there's no feedback loop, there's no potential corresponding force to account for an increase in population. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So ironically, what we've seen and the issue we now face is the opposite of what Morris is talking about. Rather than there being too many people, there are not enough people. And the birth rates in most, if not all, developed nations, I think Israel is maybe one exception, are basically, they're not even at replacement level. So the populations are contracting. Places like Japan, China, they have these highly skewed population demographics where it's basically an inverted pyramid. There are an increasing number of elderly, and there's fewer and fewer young people to replace them and support them as they age, which is a problem because the elderly obviously require a lot of economic support. Most of your healthcare costs are utilized in the latter part of your life. So we could perhaps, though, give Morris some credit in that many of the solutions he proposed have been implemented. But perhaps we could argue in some way they've been too successful, in that, again, now we're not in this subsistence stage where we've managed to level off and just we have this stable population. Now many nations are in decline, and this thing you mentioned at the end of the excerpt about if we're to do this, if we're to try and control this, it needs to be evenly distributed across the world. Well, that's not happening, because places like Africa, they're exploding population still. Now, it's possible that with further industrialization, they will also see these declines, but for now, their populations are increasing, and then the populations of places like Europe, they represent a smaller and smaller fraction of the overall world population. So we're creating this imbalance. And then Muslim countries too. One solution that Morris didn't really touch upon, I think a lot of intellectuals didn't really foresee to the extent that it has actually occurred, is this immigration phenomenon, which some view as a solution to the population problem. Well, if the native population are not breeding, we'll just import people to account for that deficit, and then that will even things out. But that obviously has certain trade-offs, and although, for example, people from Muslim countries that are imported into Europe, they may have more kids and then balance out the demographics. Well, but they also bring with them a culture that is perhaps, at least in some circles, at least at odds with the natives, and it's potentially creating this unrest and this siloing or fracturing of societies, where there's just an imbalance or incompatibility in terms of the values and the views they have on what kind of culture or what kind of country they want to live in. And this is creating a lot of tension, and it's becoming an increasingly common topic of debate, politically speaking. But we don't have to go too much into that, off on that tangent today. So to go back to Morris though, so early on he talks about glamorizing dangerous sports and pastimes. And it's perhaps apt that I record this now, because just a day or two ago, I think there was a viral video of, I don't even know what to call it, if it is actually a sport or what it was, but there appeared to be a referee and a crowd in some kind of arena. But it amounted to two men just charging at each other full tilt and just crashing into each other and basically knocking each other out. And that's perhaps in line with what Morris was imagining. And then on top of that, we see things like these slap competitions, where I think, as one doctor observed, it's quite unusual, if you even want to consider it a combat sport, because most, if not all, other combat sports, you're expected to defend yourself, whereas this one, you're deliberately instructed to not defend yourself. So the goal is to endure as much pain and damage as you can. So it's quite bizarre. Then, on the suicide stuff, Morris was suggesting this could be popularized, and this is something else that appears to have become reality. You may be familiar with certain programs. I think the one in Canada is called MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, it's called. And I think originally, like a lot of this stuff, original sort of stereotypical euthanasia case where someone is terminally ill and there's really nothing that can be done and they're just in excruciating pain. And so there's a debate about, should this person just be allowed to die? But now as time goes on, it appears the criteria to justify this assisted dying appears to be increasingly diluted. And now people that perhaps have this temporary issue, it's not even a medical issue. They're given a psychiatric diagnosis like depression or something like that. They feel down, they feel low, they don't want to live. And in that severe state that may be temporary, they're deciding to do this. They're nominating themselves to die, even though it's possible that this can all be reversed with time and some attempts at change. So that is quite concerning. Now, then we have this celibacy cult stuff, purity for kicks. And this is also something that arguably has been realized. And you may be familiar with this SINK or DINK phenomenon, which stands for single income no kids or dual income no kids. People that they perhaps do very well professionally, they make good money, but they're choosing to spend that money on themselves versus having a family, raising kids. And it's become a niche online where they vlog and record their life, spending their money on these experiences that they perhaps argue or believe that they couldn't enjoy if they were burdened with children to raise. So that is, and then perhaps tangentially or adjacent to that is the MGTOW phenomenon, which is specific to men, a subset of men that view marriage and family as sort of a rigged game due to the legal system. And so similarly, they're choosing to just earn a bunch of money to protect themselves and give themselves a comfortable life, but opt out of dating and marriage and being a parent. Okay, so that's all very interesting, but Morris acknowledges that it's possible that even if that stuff is implemented, it's not going to make a huge dent. And so he goes on to talk about contraception and abortion, which arguably has had a much bigger impact. There's been millions and millions of people that would otherwise exist if not for abortion and contraception. So it's arguable that has had a much more significant impact when it comes to creating this deficit now we now see. Perhaps at some point it was viewed positively if it was stemming an increase in population, but now it's clearly we're way beyond that point. So it's be debatable how positive this is for society as a whole. And it's a strange juxtaposition too, because on the one hand, there's been in this encouragement of contraception and the right to abortion, but at the same time, an advocacy of immigration as a means of correcting for this deficit in population. So it's interesting that both of these are simultaneously being encouraged, even though one arguably is, if the former was subtractive, then it was debatable how much justification there would be for the latter, the immigration. Okay, so he also then talks about the intelligence variable and basically predicts the movie Idiocracy, if you've seen that film, where the smart, prudent, responsible couple, they just delay because they never find the right moment, and they're always wanting to be as prepared as possible, versus the less future-focused couple that they just have unprotected sex without commitment or planning and have a bunch of kids and potentially pass on their lack of impulse control to their offspring. All right. So to just zoom out a bit, generally, just to recap. So, yeah, Morris, he was wrong about the diagnosis. He got some of the solutions right, but now the solutions are arguably exacerbating the inverse of the problem that he diagnosed, which is he feared overpopulation, and now we have a deficit, and we don't know how to fix this. No country knows how to fix this, and it's arguably one of the defining questions of our time. Just how do we... It appears that in any nation that you provide women with the freedom to choose, whether it's academically, professionally, economically, you see this corresponding decline in births. And no one seems to know how to advocate for or safeguard the former without causing the latter. Now, there have been some attempts by countries like Hungary, China, to provide economic incentives for women to have more children. But the data are they're not encouraging. They barely make a dent. And so the idea that it's simply raising a family has become unaffordable doesn't seem to hold a lot of weight. And especially if you look at Africa, which is relatively poor relative to Western nations, the birth rates are much higher. So it can't be the only reason why people are not having kids. Now then, some other people will argue, well, it's feminism. We've had this multi-generational push now, these critics of feminism will say, to encourage women to basically lap as men, to get into the workforce and compete and deprioritize family and motherhood in favor of career. And if we simply, push back culturally and overcome this trend, reject this principle, then that will be the solution. But this doesn't seem very convincing, because if you look at countries like, I mentioned China before, China has not had anywhere near the amount of top-down or mainstream or media advocacy of feminism in the last generation or two. Yet we still see this huge decline in births. They, several years ago, finally removed the one-child policy. They allowed for 2 kids, didn't move the birth rate at all, kept going down. They allowed for 3, didn't do anything. So ironically, once the restrictions were lifted, something in the mindset, the attitudes of the population had already shifted, where the desire for family was no longer there. But to go back to the feminism stuff, so yeah, the idea that feminism is the problem, it doesn't seem to be a relevant variable in countries like China, yet the issue remains. So we can potentially discount that. Now, another variable is pornography. People say, well, pornography is preventing people from having children because they have this simulation that they're gravitating towards. But that's another thing that China and other nations potentially invalidate too, because they ban this stuff. Doesn't make a difference. So the idea that, well, if America or European countries just ban porn, that everyone would start having kids. Just the data don't seem to back this up at all. So what is going on? Why, if it's not purely economics, it's not feminism, it's not pornography, although these things may have some, not that they have no effect, but it doesn't seem to be the primary issue. What is going on? And again, we go back to, is it really the case that we have to push women into this particular role and limit their options in order to have stable families? Is that really the case? Or is there another way that safeguards choice and self-determination? As I said, no one knows how to fix this. And I'm left deferring to fiction as an explanation, or a partial one. And my mind always drifts back to the little speech that Tyler Durden gives in Fight Club, which you probably heard, just to refresh your memory. What does he say? He's talking to the men, and he says, we have no great war, no great depression. Our war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. And although that's somewhat of an intangible summation of our present circumstances. It's hard not to empathize with that way of thinking, that there is this sort of intangible spiritual issue here, existential problem, when it comes to the desire to create life and perpetuate the species. And there's perhaps an increasing number of us that don't value life, and that, to reference another film, view human beings similar to the way Agent Smith does, as a kind of plague or a virus, and that the earth would be better off without them. This antinatalist attitude. So that is the question. For our time, it would appear, contrary to Morris's warnings, not how do we control population, but how do we inspire a love of life that convinces people to want to have families again. No one knows how to do this. If you can figure it out, you're probably going to be a billionaire. So good luck. I don't claim to know. Okay. Hopefully you find that interesting. By all means, have a look at the book for yourself. Fascinating read. Didn't get everything right, but who does? And it's always impressive to read something decades, generations old, and for it still to be relevant to this day. Thanks.